Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, this hybrid event, where we will be launching our new report on children and youth and risk of poverty. My name is Anna Ranninen, and I'm Head of Communications at Nordic Welfare Center. And with me is Merete Løberg, my colleague, who is going to open up this conference. Welcome, Merete.
Thank you, Anna. Welcome, everyone, to this webinar. We look forward to going through this report together with you today. So, as Anna said, my name is Merete Løberg. I am a senior advisor and a project manager at the Nordic Welfare Center. We are one out of several Nordic institutions that serves under the Nordic Council of Ministers. Our mandate is to serve as a bridge between policy, knowledge, and practice across the Nordic region, and to strengthen policy development related to the welfare and health of the Nordic population. We also try to be a platform for Nordic cooperation in this area of policy. So, how do we work? We lead a Nordic cooperation project commissioned mainly by the Nordic Council of Ministers, but we can also carry out tasks requested by the Nordic Council, like today's report. We coordinate expert networks and bring together knowledge from research, policy, and practice. We, through our work, we support ministries mainly, but also agencies, municipalities, professionals, and social and civil society throughout the Nordic region. The overall goal for the Nordic cooperation is to strengthen the welfare solutions across our common areas. We have some main focus areas at the Nordic Welfare Center. A core priority for us is the welfare and well-being of children and youth. We prioritize mainly compiling and sharing Nordic knowledge and research on children's living conditions, but we also focus on their right to participate and to be part of society and the belonging in our societies. We identify promising practice and provide recommendations for strengthening cooperation across sectors and countries. A child rights and youth perspective is at heart of our work. That means that we ensure that the children's perspectives are embedded in the development of our policy and practice. So, the report today that we launch is a result of one of our many Nordic cooperations. It is initialized by the Nordic Council and funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers that cooperate on health and social affairs. We lead the project, but we have in this project had close and good in cooperation with Norego, which is another Nordic institution, and we have been working with leading Nordic researchers. We are being supported by Nordic Research Network that are today here with us. And we are also guided by a Nordic policy expert group, which is mainly experts from the ministries in the different countries. So the purpose of this report is to answer one of the really big questions that the Nordic Council and Nordic Council of Ministers are engaged by. It's how is the families doing after the post-pandemic era? And the rising living costs and the energy prices have also furthered this question. And what we aim to in the Nordic region is to come further in looking out to how we can ensure equal opportunities for all children and youth. So this cooperation that we will learn more about today is how to ignite a Nordic discussion on risks of poverty and social inclusion. We also would like to see into the updating and sharing of Nordic knowledge and to promote more of that. We would like to focus on how to improve how we monitor and understand risk of poverty in the Nordic region and identify and share some promising policy and practice. We would like to have you with us all today and that you follow us. So now I would like to just give the word to Anna and invite our outstanding researchers that have written this report.
Over to the program that you're all here for. This is what we are going to hear about, different presentations and also discussions, and I'm so looking forward to this. And remember to put questions in the Q&A. And the first presenter and author of 2 of the chapters in the report is Tone Fletten, who will start by setting the scene for us. Welcome, Tone.
Thank you so much, Anna, and hello to all, both here in the audience and you are following us online. This is how we like to think of childhood in the Nordic countries. We think of prosperity, equality, and trust. And we think of socially active children living in families with good material living standards and children who have free access to basic services. This is how we like to envision our societies. But I will focus on a different situation and ask, what happens when children grow up with limited resources in our societies, built on the ideal of low levels of inequality? The presentation concerns why monitoring poverty remains crucial, even in the wealthy Nordic countries. And before I continue, please note that I will use the term child poverty throughout this presentation. And by that, I mean children grow up in low-income families. And let me start with what we could call a Nordic paradox. All the Nordic countries are ranked among the 12 top countries in the UN Human Development Index. This is an index of the prosperity and wealth and well-functioning of societies. We do all have extensive universal welfare systems, and in international comparisons, children and young people in the Nordic countries have good living conditions. But over the past 2-3 decades, the share of young people living in poor families has risen. This is an example from Norway with a very large text I can see. Something happened here in the transformation here. And it has increased quite a lot from 1996 to 2004, should be there on the 2024 should be on the bottom here. So this is an example of how the child poverty rate has increased and at least not decreased in many other countries. And in recent years, even the demand for food aid among families with children have risen in our countries. And this could be an example of Nordic paradox. We have very good welfare societies, but still children are still poor in our countries. And if we look a few centuries back, child poverty was not framed as a distinct social problem in our countries. This was not because child poverty did not exist, but it was not fully recognized to be a problem in our countries. And it's not very strange, because from the 1960s to 1980s, our countries were marked by nearly full employment, a very compressed wage structure, which created low income inequality, and we had redistributive policies in addition that further down, level down the income inequality. We had universal transfers, and equally important, we had public services that reduced the family's costs. So in this way, we were used to think that our countries functioned very, very well, and poverty was a limited, not a structural problem. And the question was really, are children poor in our countries? The prevailing assumption was that the institutions we had in place, they functioned as intended, and we did not have child poverty. And it was in the sense it even existed, it was understood as an exception rather than an emerging social pattern. And what happened? Well, population composition changed, employment became more precarious, and income inequality widened. And the assumption was that still our institution would be able to the assumptions changed, so we didn't no longer think that the institutional framework was sufficient. And it became increasingly difficult to sustain the idea that there were not poverty in our countries. And child poverty moved on to the political agenda in all the countries. It didn't suddenly appear in the 1990s, but it became named, measured, and politicized. And 4 developments were central to understand this development. First, the civil society mobilization. Organizations such as Save the Children and UNICEF documented children's living conditions and made the issue visible in the public sphere in our countries. Second, research and improved data. Register-based studies made it possible to track low-income families with children over time and to see how vulnerability was distributed among the population. And third, European and international influence. The Lisbon Strategy and the EU's social inclusion agenda placed relative poverty on the policy map, and this influenced also the Nordic discussions. And fourth, party political dynamics, of course. Debates over welfare retrenchment, work incentives, and benefit reforms sharpened the political conflict around child poverty. So the renewed attention to child poverty resulted from these combined developments. It was built through documentation, advocacy, and political disagreement. And once child poverty was on the agenda, the next question became, how should it be understood and how should it be measured? It's a relatively broad agreement in the Nordics that poverty should be understood as a relative phenomenon, but there's far less agreement on how it should be measured. Should we rely on income thresholds? Should we look at living conditions? Or should we measure participation and social exclusion? These dimensions overlap, but they are not identical. Income measures economic position, living conditions capture material outcomes, and participation reflects social inclusion. The correlation between these dimensions is real, but it is far from perfect, which is shown in this figure. And the choice of indicator matters. It affects how large the problem appears, it influences how the problem is interpreted, and it shapes which policy solutions are prioritized. The measurement debate is therefore not a distraction. It is central to how poverty is understood and governed in the Nordic welfare states. Once we decide how to measure poverty, the next question becomes, who is most affected? And regardless of measurement approach, one finding is consistent. Some groups face substantially higher risk than others. Families with weak labor market and attachment, single-parent households, large families, and families with an immigrant or refugee background. But the important point is not just higher risk. It is that disadvantages often cluster. Low income rarely comes alone. It often coincides with unstable employment, housing challenges, health issues, or limited social networks. This is why child poverty is not only an income problem. It is frequently a situation of multiple and overlapping disadvantages. And that's what makes policy responses more complex. At the same time, belonging to a high-risk group does not mean that all families in that group are poor. We are talking about higher probabilities, not determinism. Increase, or at least lack of decrease of child poverty, reflects broader processes of structural change. There is not a single explanation of the development. Demographic changes matters, shifts in population composition alter risk profiles. The rise in single-parent households and increased immigrations are examples of this. Labor market transformation matters. Rising skill demands and declining earnings at the bottoms are developments that influence child poverty. And welfare policy design matters, especially how transfers develop related to wages and prices, but also the services and measures introduced to strengthen human capital. But the key point is interaction. Poverty trends reflect changes in demography, labor markets, and policy design. Child policy is therefore shaped by broader societal transformations and by how public institutions respond to them. This raises the question of what these structural developments means for children's living conditions. And research from the Nordic countries conveys a dual message. First, there are robust statistical associations between low income and a range of outcomes. Children growing up in low-income families face a higher risk of disadvantages across multiple domains: education, housing, health, participation, and later labor market attachment and wage. But second, increased risk does not imply universal harm. Poverty increases probability, but it does not determine destiny. The more difficult question concerns causality. Are poorer outcomes driven directly by low income itself, or do they primarily reflect correlated family and environmental factors? Many studies identify strong associations. Fewer can isolate causal mechanisms. This distinction has implications for policy design. If inadequate resources are the key mechanisms, income support is crucial. If correlated family factors dominate, broader interventions are required. Even if causal mechanisms remain debated, the consistent association between low income and disadvantages remain relevant for policy decisions. And even if poverty does not determine outcomes for all children, it raises normative questions in the Nordic context. First, it concerns rights. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child establishes the right to an adequate standard of living of equal opportunities for participation. And child poverty violates that right. Second, it challenges Nordic egalitarian ideals. The Nordic welfare states are built on the ambition to reduce inequality and to secure equal life chances. The existence of child poverty can be seen as a breach with this ideal. Third, persistent child poverty may affect social trust. High trust societies depend on the perception that institutions function fairly and that the opportunities are broadly shared. Child poverty therefore matters not only because of its consequences for individuals, but because of what it tells us about how the welfare state functions. Persistent child poverty raises the question about whether existing arrangements function as intended. This is why child poverty matters, not only as a statistical exercise, but as a basis for policy adjustments. And the recent cost of living crisis illustrates why this discussion is not theoretical. Rapid price increases have shown how difficult it is to shield all vulnerable groups when living costs rise sharply. Even in our comprehensive welfare states, adjustment mechanisms are not always immediate or perfectly targeted. At the same time, rising prices do not necessarily appear in relative poverty statistics. Relative poverty is defined as a share of median income. And median income in itself is not directly affected by rising prices, only by changes in income and in the income distribution. This implies that relative poverty can remain stable even when real purchasing power declines. And if price increases are concentrated on essential goods, as food and housing and electricity, families with the lowest incomes may experience the greatest strain, even without a change in their relative income position. They will not appear as poor in statistics, but they have fewer possibilities to spend money. So the cost of living crisis, it illustrates a tension between income-based monitoring and real living conditions. And it shows how continuous attention to the material conditions remains important, even when relative poverty rates remain stable. And this is precisely why monitoring cannot rely on a single indicator. It must be continuous, multidimensional, and attentive to real living conditions. Monitoring child poverty serves several essential functions. It contributes to safeguarding children's rights. It tests welfare state performance. It helps detect early warning signals before temporary pressures become structural problems. It enables evidence-based policy, and it reduces the risk of long-term societal costs. Without systematic monitoring, we cannot evaluate policy effectiveness. We cannot adjust early, and we cannot prioritize effectively. Monitoring allows us to move from political controversy and fragmented measures toward knowledge-based coordination and long-term institutional learning. In that sense, child poverty functions as an indicator of welfare state performance. The Nordic welfare state share important institutional foundations. In our countries, we find high levels of social trust, universal welfare arrangements, a regulated labor market, and a strong emphasis on distribution and equality. At the same time, they also face many of the same structural challenges: demographic change, labor market transformation, fiscal pressure, and increasing inequality. These shared foundations and shared challenges make child poverty monitoring a joint Nordic task. Monitoring allows us to compare situations, to learn from one another, and to adjust policies over time. It contributes to ensuring that our common institutional ambitions remain credible over time. The Nordic model has long relied on knowledge production, transparency, and institutional learning, and child poverty monitoring can be understood as one important element within this tradition of evidence policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Tone, for setting the scene and building the foundation for the rest of the presentations. And if that wasn't clear to you, we're going in chapter order here. So this is the first chapter in the report as well. In your presentation, you described that in the 90s, child poverty made the agenda, so to speak. What would you say the state is today?
Well, I would say that it's still on the agenda, although not always in all the countries labeled as child poverty. But exclusion of children and young people is definitely on the agenda. I have not conducted a media analysis to say what is happening in all the countries at the moment, but child poverty is high on the agenda for NGOs. And in many of the governments do also have child poverty very high on the agenda. There are examples of action plans, for instance, against child poverty in Norway, in Sweden, and in Finland. And I think that child poverty is seen as a really important problem. So I would say it's still on the agenda. I can't tell if it's enough on the agenda, but it's on the agenda, definitely.
That's comforting to hear. And also here in the room, here on site, there are a lot of researchers in the room, but with us online today, there's a lot of NGO representatives and representatives from many municipalities. So feel free to add your own comments to this if you like, using the Q&A function. Is there anyone in the audience here on site who has a question for Tone? No? Then we thank you for this time, because you will be back with chapter 4 later on. Thank you. And next, we are going to make space for chapter 2 in the report, presentations on the trends on child poverty over 2 decades. And I want to welcome up Maria Bobrinskaya here, and also Deborah Biger, who is getting mic'd up. So you have you're doing the presentation together. So you can use either the clicker or the arrows. So just go ahead. Thank you.
So first, thank you very much, Anna, for presenting us. I'm Deborah. I'm a researcher here at Nordregio. And
my name is Maria Bobrinska. I'm also working with Nordregio, the GIS and data.
Okay, so what we are going to do is to present the highlights from the second chapter that we wrote in the report, which gives an overview of the state of child poverty. And the first question or discussion is, how do we measure poverty, or what do we present in this report? And again, Tone talked a moment ago about the implication of measurement, and different measurement will give us different results or different aspects of child poverty. So I will just give an overview of what we use in this. And of course, it's not giving us the full picture that we could have had, but I will show what we are focusing now. So in the report, what we focus is on child poverty based on indicators from the Eurostat, and we use three main indicators. The first one refers to relative poverty using the AROP, at risk of poverty and at risk of poverty. And it is based on the share of children or share of individuals, that have income that is less than 60% of the equivalent income in the country in which they live. This means that it's relative and it's income-based. It's comparing to other individuals in the same countries. But this is, again, it's based on income, and it's a limited picture of poverty overall. So in order to have some more broad perspective, we also use material deprivation. We will not show so many results about that in this presentation, but in the report itself, we also focus on material deprivation. And this is based on a questionnaire in which individuals are asked to what extent they have access to different essential needs that they have in the society, which are defined as things that individuals need for a specific society. And this represents the share of individuals that do not have the access to this. And the last one is defined as at risk of poverty and social exclusion, which takes into account both first indicators, at risk of poverty, then material deprivation, and also include the extent to which individuals are living in households with very low work intensity, so jobless houses. So these are the three indicators that we use in the report. And now we will show results based on that. So we aim to give an overview based on these indicators. And again, I highlight that this is just a partial result of what we can know, and try to do it using a comparable definition. And that's why we use this definition from the Eurostat. So what you see here, you see the risk of poverty in 2024 of all the countries within Europe. You see that we highlighted in red the European average, and we also see that in light blue we have the result within the Nordics. So if we compare, as Tone said a moment ago, the Nordics are doing relatively good when we compare to other countries within Europe or globally. But still, we have differences across the countries within the Nordics, and we also will see that there are changes over time that we should take into account. And second, which was also mentioned a moment ago, that poverty or child poverty is many times concentrated at a specific group, which we will focus on.
Mm-hmm. So yes, let's look at how this trend developed historically. You can see this graph that shows AROP for total population for Nordics compared with European average. And we can clearly see that most of the Nordic countries have been doing relatively well compared to this European average. And still doing, except for Sweden, where we can see that starting from 2008, the AROP rate started to grow significantly when it's actually peaked and exceeded the European average in 2019, and it kept quite high ever since. So we can see from this data that poverty is increasing in Sweden, not so much in other Nordic countries. But what happens with children as a group? To analyze that, we looked at how risk of poverty rates are spread across the different groups, age groups in the Nordic countries. And you can see that it's completely different for all of them. So there is no pattern that you can see. But what is clearly visible that, for example, children less than 6 years old are of highest risk for Sweden, where it actually the rate exceeds the European average. But similar trend is also recorded in Iceland, where the same group of children less than 6 years old is at highest risk. But it's not only this group that we can highlight. Children less than 18 years old are also at risk for both Sweden and to some extent Iceland. This trend also have developed over time. So now we are looking at the same graph as we saw before for total population, but now only focusing on children who are less than 18 years old. And we see that the trend is similar. So we also see that Nordic countries are doing better than the European average, except of Sweden, where the poverty rate for children has started to grow in 2008. Yeah, it peaked also in 2019, how the same as for total population, and it still remains high. But what we see here that is different is that for Norway, for example, a similar trend started to develop in 2012, where when the rate started to grow and also peaked at 2020 and 2021. And we are yet to see how this trend will develop further. So this is the graph that is based on the indicator by Eurostat, so 60% of median equalized income. But some countries prefer to use 50% of median equalized income, which is also an established indicator. But when we look at that data, the trend is similar. Of course, the numbers are lower relatively if you compare them with 60%. But the overall pattern is the same. Nordic countries in general are doing better than the European average. Sweden is an exception here with growing rate of poverty rate, and a similar trend as I mentioned at the previous slide can be recorded for Norway. So no matter which indicator you will use, child poverty risk is growing in Sweden and to some extent in Norway. So one of the ways that countries use to mitigate this risk of poverty and reduce it eventually is to apply social transfers. So on this graph, we can see at distribution of EROP, risk of poverty rate, before social transfers and after social transfers. And if before, the Nordic countries have different values and each is unique, then after applying social transfers, most of them significantly reduce the poverty rate, and the level is capped around 10 or 12%, except for Sweden, where after applying social transfer, it still remains quite high and even higher than European average. So we looked before on national level rates and compared countries, Nordic countries with each other and European average. But what actually happens within the Nordic countries? You can see the map here. It shows the risk of poverty rate for children in 2023 across Nordic municipalities. And it's actually quite easy to read. The darker the color is, the higher the poverty rate is. And it's clearly seen that it's very varied. The first thing that we noted is that the higher rate is recorded in rural municipalities, but also each of the countries have different variations to that. For example, Finland, that has the lowest rate across the Nordics, it's less than 10%, has some municipalities where at risk of poverty rate for children exceeds 25%. somewhat similar situation happens in Norway, but municipalities can hit 30% or even higher in some cases. And Sweden, having the biggest AROP rate across the Nordics, also has a bit different spatial distribution within the country. 17% of municipalities in Sweden have at risk of poverty rate for children of over 25%, which basically in practice means that in these municipalities, every fourth kid is at risk.
So what we can see is that geography plays an important role in shaping a risk of poverty, and we see some differences across regions. But what other household characteristics are important to the risk of poverty? And Tune mentioned most of them a moment ago, but we will just go and see what are the results when we focus on different groups. So starting with household composition in general, who are in the household, what is the composition and household type, we see that overall the total risk of poverty differ across the countries, but households with children do not have higher risk of poverty in general. And specifically when we focus on households that have two parents and one or two children, they don't have higher risk of poverty relative to the total population or to other. However, there are two cases that are important to mention, and we saw, Tune mentioned them a moment ago. They are related to households with a large household, adults, two adults and three or more children. And this is the case mostly in Sweden, but to some extent also in Norway. But they are in general higher risk of poverty for this household compared to living with smaller families. And the other group that is very important to mention is children growing up with single parents household. They have substantially higher risk of poverty, and this is much more important in the case of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. So all of these cases are highlighting the importance of single parents household for risk of poverty. The second aspect that was mentioned, and it's important, is attachment to the labor market. And of course, the main source of income for many families is work. So this is related to the fact that we need to work, or people need to work in order to have income. But the extent to which this gradient is shaping the risk of poverty differ across the country. So in all countries, children that grow up in families with very low work intensity, which means that their parents are practically joblessness, have substantially higher risk of poverty. And vice versa, children that grow up with both parents that work full-time have very low risk of poverty. But the differences to the extent of changing between these groups is very different across the countries. And we see that specifically in Sweden and to some extent in Norway, children that grow up with families with very low labor market attachment have very, very high risk of poverty. So labor market attachment is very important for shaping the risk of poverty. And related to the labor market attachment is also educational attainment. And the level of educational attainment of the parents is associated with the risk of poverty of the children. And children that grow up with family in cases in which both parents are educated have very low risk of poverty compared to the situation in which both parents have low level of education. And this is much more important when we look at the comparison of Norway and Sweden compared to Iceland, in which the gaps are not so high. Comparing whether your parents are educated or not does not really makes a huge difference compared to the situation in Sweden and Norway, just comparing across the countries. And then, as was mentioned a moment ago, children of refugees and children of migrants have higher risk of poverty, and we can see that in all the countries. What we use here is the two indicators that are available at the Eurostat, one based on the place of birth of the parents, and the second one based on the citizenship of the parents. So place of birth is a constant variable, you can change it, but whether you acquire the citizens change somewhat. So we do see some differences, but overall the picture is clear. Children that grow up in a household in which their parents are migrants have a higher risk of poverty compared to growing up in a household in which your parents are natives. But these gaps, the association between the location of their parents' place of birth and the risk of poverty differ between the countries. And again, the gaps are very small in the case of Iceland, and to some extent Norway and Sweden are much higher. To some extent, we see differences across the country. So I will try to summarize and say what are the key takeaways from this presentation or from the report. Overall, we see that the Nordic countries are doing better than the EU average. There are relatively low risk of poverty compared to other countries. However, we also see a change over time, at least when we measure using this indicator, the risk of poverty comparing to other at risk of poverty. And this is the case in Sweden and in Norway. In addition, we see that there are geographical differences with highest risk of poverty at rural areas, specifically in Sweden and Finland, but also in the other countries. And again, these groups that are associated, and as Tone suggested a moment ago, these indicators are many times overlapping. So coming from a single parent household, from a large families, migration background and low attachment to the labor market, they are all associated with higher risk of poverty. And it's not a single indicator. They are working together to shape the risk of poverty of children. And that's it.
Thank you. I'm having a balancing act here as I have the questions in the computer that comes in. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And I wanted to say that in your presentation, you show this map. I don't know who I'm going to, I'll ask you. Okay. On this map, the blue map with all the different shades of blue, that's the regional data. We have a lot of people from municipalities and regions watching. How do they use this data on a regional and local level, do you think?
First, I want to say that it's at the municipal level, and I think it's important to know that these municipalities where the risk of poverty are high are in general probably municipalities that have low income and so forth. So it's kind of like when we measure risk of poverty, we measure it relative to the national average. But then when we look at the specific municipality, we compare it to the national average. So then we see these differences. How do we use it at a local level or municipality level? Just kind of like knowing where you stand within. And I think this is highlighting the need of some municipality to have more intervention related to the risk of poverty. But we didn't go further from that. And I think that's something that for future research we should also focus, because specifically now we look at the municipal level, but many municipalities are quite big and poverty is many times concentrated in specific neighborhood within municipalities. So it's kind of like not really showing the entire variation within some municipalities. But we see that these differ, and again, these are many times rural municipalities that have other aspects also that shape these outcomes for the children also.
Yes, thank you. Do you want to add something to this?
No.
No? You're happy? So not only differences between the countries and between the municipalities and also within the municipalities. Yes, thank you. And we have gotten some questions. And one of the questions came in during Tone's presentation. So if Victor could present Tone with a microphone if she wants to add something, because some of the issues were risen in this presentation. And one question is, how old are these children? When we talk about children, how old are they? And here you had below 18 in your presentation. And if you did you have any other? It was the same, so below 18. Another question was, which you also touched upon, it's a citizenship. Who do we count as being a citizen? Any comments on that?
And this is based on the definition. Once you acquire the citizenship, you are the citizen. So it's changed over time. If you are a citizen, not of a Nordic country, but a country in which you live. It's having a citizenship of the country where you live. So this is what. And it's a very crude indicator, of course.
And the others who follow with the presentations, if you have another definition, so just please name it. And then there was a question from the room. Welcome. Then that gives me some time to yeah, okay.
Hi, my name is Laura. I come from Finland. Thank you for the presentation. It was curious to see that maybe it differs about the indicator you are using, but what we have seen that child poverty has been increasing in Finland. And I think in your presentation, okay, it stops in 2023, but like it showed a little bit different than what we are seeing right now.
And and your definition is based on the AROP at risk of poverty?
Yeah.
Relative. So this is the Eurostat data. I'm not sure kind of like what are the differences, but still kind of like this is what we see from that indicator. So maybe we should kind of like see which indicators you are using and kind of like how is it measured, so then we can try and compare.
I think it's also important to note that the data that we use ends in 2023 or 2024. So maybe what you are saying is relevant to newer data.
Actually, it has increased from the 2020 actually, and it's living condition statistics in
Okay.
Finland. What we are looking for, but it's differs. That's my point.
Okay.
We had some more questions, I think.
Yes, well, thank you for the presentation. I'm from Denmark, and I was actually following Laura's question because I was also curious about the development in Denmark. And I perhaps it's due to the fact that Eurostat is measured quite differently than what we do in the registers in Denmark, because I couldn't really recognize the trend. We have experienced quite an increase. It's been stagnated for the last few years, but yeah, so perhaps, I don't know if you could reflect on or elaborate a little bit on how the data are measured.
Okay, it's the measurement is the official measurement that Eurostat is using for child poverty based on different.
It's survey-based, right?
Exactly, it's the EU. It's based on the EU SILC definition on child poverty, and again, I'm not sure which definition kind of like it is used, but I will happily compare it and look what is published there. But maybe on another aspect that kind of like this is not kind of like taking into account cost of living that might be associated. And this is just kind of like without.
I think the issue then is the survey based, because I think we, at least on other registers, we have some discrepancy with the Danish registers versus survey based.
Exactly, but that's the official, and needing to compare, that's kind of like what we needed to compromise in that aspect.
Thank you.
I think it's we can also mention here probably that our aim was to find comparable indicators that will work for all the countries in question, and that turned to be quite a tricky task. So we understand these limitations, that probably they don't cover the full picture, but then that's also the question for like further studies or suggesting other indicators that we can use to compare the countries to show more details.
Or specifically using a register-based kind of like comparison that is not. But again, you need to then have the definition that in the beginning, that was the aim, to try and look at something that is register-based, but then you need to make sure the definition is comparable. And that's another challenge that we need to deal with.
And we have one final question here in the room.
Thank you. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. My name is Bonnie Jensen. I'm from University of Greenland. And maybe I'm a little off scope here, but I'm very curious because you have the highest rates of rural municipalities in Sweden and Finland. And I wonder if you have touched upon the question about indigenous children. Also because Tone talked about, I think you had 4 indicators, children in unemployment and immigrants and so on and so forth. And I think about, we have different kind of indigenous populations in the Nordic countries, the Sami people, the Inuit people, the Roma Gypsy traveler people. Is that a part of anything of this? No.
No, we don't have a way to, it's not part of the surveys in general, this question, so we don't have a way to assess it. And this is exactly the data from Eurostat, so we can't really focus on that. And that's, again, something that we could have done, but I'm not sure if we would have more information, even if we use the register for that, because it's not in all countries you will have the definition in the register of this. So you will end up the same, that we don't have information, but probably there is research that have focused on that and not part of this.
And I'll give the last to Merete.
Yeah, I just had to add to your question, because I think it's a really important question to raise in the Nordic cooperation, because what we have today is a report that is based on what data are available today. So we haven't gathered any new data. This is what's in the existing databases. But what we see is what Deborah and Maria is pointing out, that we would need perhaps in the future to know more about the rural areas and also differences within the municipalities and in the larger communities. So that's it. I think it's a really important question you're raising, but that needs another focus than we have had the mandate to do this time. But it's we would like to do that, but that takes some more cooperation, I think. Don't you agree, Deborah?
Thank you very much for your presentation. Applause once more. I want to say welcome to Geir Holtan Møller and Karin Gustafsen, who will share this presentation together. Chapter 3. Welcome.
Yes, hello. As said, I will now present chapter 3 of the report. And in this chapter, we present 5 measures that promote social mobility among children and young people growing up in low-income families. First, I will give a short description of the 5 measures, and thereafter Karin Gustafsen will give a more general analysis of these measures. The 5 measures we have selected cover the following key contexts in children's lives. It's the family, early childhood education and care, or kindergarten, the school, leisure activities, and the general local community. 3 of the 5 are universal measures, and these include high quality early childhood education and care, ECEC, the whole school approach, and area-based initiatives. In these cases, the efforts apply to everyone within the context, but the efforts are expected to be particularly important for children and young people from low-income families. In the chapter, we have also included measures that promote participation in leisure activities more generally, and with a particular focus on the leisure card. And these can be designed both as a universal and a selective measure, or as a combination of both. This is what we call a proportionate universalism. Finally, we include also family or parenting support. And in the report, we have shown examples of 3 family support measures, and those are in general selective measures. The first measure is high quality early childhood education and care. I will say ECEC from now on, I think it's easier. The core idea here is quality in everyday practice, which is especially beneficial for children growing up in low-income families. And when we talk about high quality, we mainly mean what is often referred to as process quality. This includes emotional available staff, language-rich and cognitive stimulating interactions, support for children's self-regulation, and stable relationships. These are characteristics of ECEC that can compensate for both stress and limited stimulation at home. They therefore matter most for children from low-income families and at the stage in life where early support is really makes a difference. It also has a well-documented positive effect on children's development, both in the short and the long term, and the effect is particularly strong for children from low-income families. This is the first. The second measure we present in the report is what we call whole school approach. This isn't really a single intervention, but rather a broad framework that can include a range of different measures and tools. And at its core, whole school approach is about helping students thrive by supporting their mental health and well-being, strengthening relationship, and creating positive and inclusive school environment. A whole school approach is best understood as an overarching framework. It rests on three core elements, you can say. This is, for the first, a shared value base, an organizational infrastructure, and a system for ongoing learning and development. Together, these elements shape everyday practice, culture, and decision-making across the school. And based on this overarching framework, a range of universal and selective measures may be used dynamically to provide both general support for all students and more tailored support for those with identified needs. Existing evaluation of whole school approach shows mixed results, but generally promising results also, with positive effects on students' mental health, social and emotional competence, and school climate, and also academic outcomes. Although most studies are conducted outside the Nordic countries, several findings indicate that the whole school approach can be effective when implemented over time. Means that you are using time to implement them. But even though the evaluation shows rather mixed results, and there are few Nordic studies, as I said, we have included the whole school approach in the chapter because school is so important in children's development. It is important, not least because school can either reinforce existing inequalities or help reduce them. Therefore, in our opinion, this makes it important to develop whole school approaches in the Nordic context that also aim to promote social equity. Okay, the third measure is family support, or parent or family support. There are many different versions of this type of intervention, and in the chapter we have described 3 examples. I've translated them into English, and it's called New Patterns. It's a Norwegian program, Entrance to Entrance. It's a Danish program, and a Nurse Family Partnership, which is originally from United States, and it is used in Norway the last years. What these measures have in common is that families are supported by dedicated professionals or coordinators. And trust and relationship building are essential to ensure that this support is effective. In general, the coordinator provides practical assistance in managing daily tasks, such as help with routines, finance, and housing. And in the 3 examples we have picked out, an important task is also to support the family accessing ordinary public service and to coordinate this service. The expected effect of these measures are to reduce parent stress and instability, and also give stronger parent capacity to support their children. And overall improvements in family life, which is the most important arena in children's upbringing. The 4th measure is the leisure card scheme. This is an economic subsidy designed to lower the threshold for children's participation in leisure activities. It can be both universal and selective. An universal scheme means that all children receive the same economic support, while a selective scheme is targeting children from low-income families. In the report, we present a Danish municipal model that in general combines universal and maybe mostly selective elements. So also in some places, and in addition, some places also include a guidance component to the card. And this is what we call, this is a good example of what we call proportional universalism. Proportionate universalism basically means giving everyone access to the same service, but offering extra support to those who need more. Research show that the key factor in the leisure card is not just access to participation, but the qualities of the leisure arena itself. The research show that what really makes a difference is having friends around, being part of a social network, having supportive adults to turn to. And it's also important that the leisure environment helps strengthening children's sense of mastery and identity, while providing for a space that feels safe and protected for them. So economic finance is one thing, but maybe most important is what arenas they are going into. Okay, the last measure we have described in the report is area-based initiatives. Across the Nordic countries, these initiatives look a bit different. Some focus more on housing and planning, others more on social measures. And in our chapter, we have focused primarily on the social side of the social measures. Even though we have limited evidence of the long-term effects of area-based initiatives on education outcomes or social mobility, it can make a difference through at least 2 types of measures, which is typical in area-based initiatives. First, these are measures that improve access to service by reducing fragmentation across sectors and making it easier for families with limited resources to get current support around their children. The second measure are these are measures that aim to strengthening the local social environment by encouraging people to take active part in local development and by creating more inclusive arenas where children and families feel they belong. So over time, these measures are expected to result in more trust, safety, and social cohesion. And in the research, we also talk about the neighborhood effect. These are characteristics of the local social environment that have an independent, positive influence on children and young people beyond the effect of the family factor. So the area has effect despite the family or low income situation in the family. Okay, what ties this together? If you look at these 5 measures through Bronfenbrenner's lens, they all work by strengthening the environment closest to children. They support the family, kindergarten, school, leisure activities, and the neighborhood. They also strengthen the everyday interaction children have with adults and peers, and they make the connection between home, school, leisure, and other services. So in general, the overall aim of this measure is to build environments that support greater social equality in children's development. So this was the 5 measures, and Karin will now try to make an overall analysis of them. Okay.
Thank you, Geir. And as you have heard now in this chapter, we have presented 5 types of measures that, in different ways, seek to promote social mobility and counteract the negative consequences of growing up in low-income families. And here you can read it. And the measures vary in structure, design, and target group, but they all rest on a core assumption that inequality can be compensated for through targeted, high quality, and relationship-oriented interventions. Research shows that the category of the interventions in itself is not sufficient. It is the specific characteristic of the intervention, such as quality,
continuity, accessibility, and relational mechanism that determine their effectiveness. And we said in our chapter that the condition for this is high quality early childhood education that Geir talked about, and care becomes effective only when children encounter emotionally available adults, language-rich environments, play-based learning, social structure, stability, and a sense of security. And whole school approaches is not a single intervention, but an overarching framework that creates currents across multiple compensatory mechanisms. Research indicates that these measures can be effective for students from low socioeconomic background, particularly when they are implemented over time, are well coordinated, and combine academic and social components. And support programs and more system-oriented models. Such measures also include a system for capacity building within the service apparatus, thereby laying the foundation for developing poverty-aware services. And this contributes to strengthen the relationship between low-income families and the support system. And trust is key. And economic and organizational mechanisms that increase children's participation in leisure activities. These interventions function as an entry point to arenas with potentially a strong relation and identify forming mechanism. And this can strengthen the potential for social mobility. And when it comes to area-based initiatives, these differ from the previous four in that they do not target a single arena, but rather the totality of children's environments. Research also shows that relationship building is one of the most essential features of such initiatives. And we have several important messages in our chapter, but now we will highlight this message. Relationships cannot be regarded as the sole or primary mechanism behind social equalization. The Nordic welfare states are fundamentally built on universal economic arrangement, such as child benefits, subsidized early childhood education, free schooling, and public support to student financing. And this is important. All these arrangements have historically contributed more to social mobility than most relational-oriented interventions. So in this light, relational mechanisms help explain how service make an impact, but they cannot substitute for the foundational role of economic security. And we have also a final reflection, and you can read it as I read it. A key intervention that should be integrated across all areas discussed is the strengthening of knowledge and competence. Services that work with low-income families must have knowledge about what poor living conditions entail, what socioeconomic stress is, and how to practice it in a way that is sensitive to disadvantaged living conditions. This includes knowledge about the brain's responses to stress and how stress can trigger cognitive, psychological, and somatic challenges. And we said that services must adopt brain health promoting living conditions, aware practice in every level from leadership to frontline staff. And we will also point out evidence-informed practice, for there is a need to promote evidence-informed practice as a guiding principle for the development and implementation of measures and policy instruments. Evidence-informed practice are a balanced integration of research-based and theoretical knowledge, professional expertise and judgment, and service users' experience and perspective. And enables adaptation to local conditions and addresses complex family situation and maintain a strong knowledge foundation. So this is also essential. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you, for this presentation on what's actually done in the Nordic countries about this problem. And I have a question for you. You described the whole school approach as a dynamic framework rather than a fixed model. And if a municipality out there listening now would take a first step towards this direction, what should they do?
Well, I would say not start a new program, because there is a lot of programs in school. There are a lot of different actors who want to go into the school. So I will say that they should start with themselves and think, what is the purpose? What do we want with this? Is it school climate? Is it academic progress we want, or is it equity we want to win? That's maybe the most important, that they define what they want themselves, not a lot of external actors defining what they should do. Because the problem is, I think, that there is a lot of programs, a lot of external actors who want to use the school for their different initiatives, and that's why the school also get fragmented. Yeah. So that's maybe the most important, and thereafter look what they already got, not throw out the good thing they already have. And then maybe last you can see whether there are some new things who can be added to the approach you are choosing.
Addition to what you already have in place that works. Yes. Thank you very much. Anyone in the audience on site who has a question? No? Yes? We have one, if Victor could come with the microphone.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really interesting and great 5 promising practices. I was just wondering how you decided on these 5, how you came about, because there's so many different practices out there. And very much agreed that early intervention is the most important thing. But when you look at the presentation from before, they were showing the association between the education of parents and child poverty. And you would think a promising practice involving higher education should be somewhere there. If we're talking about social mobility, that's probably one of the most fundamental foundations for social mobility is higher education. Huh? So I'm just wondering why that wasn't there and how you came about with these 5, which are great. But yeah, there's so many others I'm thinking of.
I think I can add only 2 words: Bronfenbrenner and early intervention. That's the philosophy behind. Bronfenbrenner is a theoretical basis for the election of measures here, and he is talking about the microsystem, the mesosystem, how school and family and local neighbor or the social service, how they work together, which is the mesosystem. And yeah, so he is the theoretical basis for this, and we also think early intervention, because very much of what is happening later in the education has its root already in early in kindergartens or in very early age. This is the philosophy, at least.
Okay, thank you. Was that all? Thank you again. And now we have come to the last chapter. As I promised, Tone Fletten will be back and give a presentation. Now we heard about child poverty and the trends and what we do about these problems in our countries. And now to one maybe the most important questions: what is the children's own experience of growing up in a family with low income? Welcome.
Thank you. And hello again. Children find themselves in a situation in which they compare themselves with other children on a daily basis, as the Danish researchers Jørgen Elm Andersen and Maja Larsen puts it. And they continue. Other children may come to see poorer children as different. They may not have the same, they may not be able to take part in the same activities. They may not have the same material possessions, or they may dress differently. In a range of ways, they may stand out from the crowd. Such differentness can trigger a process of stigmatization and exclusion. This presentation is not about poverty statistics, it's about what standing out feels like for children and young people. Early research focused almost exclusively on the family's economic situation. The concern was how adults coped with insufficient resources, and children were rarely included as informants. But for children in low-income families, poverty is not an economic indicator. It is a lived experience. If we want to understand that experience, we must listen to children themselves. Children and young people are not passive recipients of circumstances. They are competent social actors, and they are experts on their own lives. 20 years ago, the British researcher Tess Ridge took this insight seriously. In her pioneering study, she documented how children describe poverty in their own words, not as income poverty, but as everyday exclusions. Children rarely talk about income thresholds or median income. They talk about not going on the class trip, not having the right clothes, not being able to invite friends home. That is where poverty becomes real for them. And this Venn diagram illustrates the relationship between income, participation, and belonging, and the three overlaps, but they're not identical. You can think of it like this. Income is the background, participation is the stage, and belonging is the feeling children walk away with. Income does not determine belonging, but it affects the resources available for participation. Before turning to children's own accounts, let me stress an important nuance, which I also mentioned in the first part. Not all children growing up in low-income families experience exclusion, but the risk is higher. We are dealing with probabilities, not destinies. This well-known image is seen in two ways. You can see a vase, or you can see two faces. The image of poverty is also twofold. Poverty increases the likelihood of disadvantage, but it does not define every child's life. An example from Denmark illustrates this. 1/3 of children in income-poor families report that they have low material standard, but that means that 2/3 do not. At the same time, the share who report low material standard is 5 times higher among children from poor families than in the general child population in Denmark. So it's higher risk or probability of problems. So outcomes are not predetermined, but risk is clearly unequally distributed. But numbers alone cannot tell us how this risk is experienced in everyday life. For that, we must turn to children themselves. Much of the research on children in poverty are within the social indicators tradition. Large-scale surveys, such as Children and Youth in Denmark, Young in Norway, and The Child's Voice in Finland, examine differences in living conditions and attitudes across the socioeconomic groups. These studies are essential to identify structural patterns. There are, however, relatively few Nordic studies that analyze children's own narratives of growing up in poverty, but there are some. And when it comes to in-depth interviews with children who are growing up in low-income families, the role NGOs have been important. The organizations have for many years documented children's everyday experiences of economic hardship and social exclusion. And in the following, I will draw both on the academic studies and the NGO reports. Most of these contributions are qualitative. This means they are not statistically generalizable. Yet, the remarkable consistency of themes across countries, methods, and organizations suggests that we are not looking at isolated stories, but at shared patterns. And let me start with an example of a young person who expresses that her family is not able to meet her basic needs. Sometimes you do not have breakfast at home, and I'm hungry at school. I'm so hungry that I can't think. Situations like this are luckily uncommon in our Nordic welfare states, but they do exist. We find several such expressions in the qualitative material, and for some children, hunger is real. It affects concentration in school, it may affect participation in everyday activities, and it can shape how children experience their own position among peers. And as I mentioned earlier, the cost of living crisis with soaring food prices have led to an increase in families with children asking for food aid across Nordic countries. And the situation is not abstract for their peers either. Some children understand the situation and describe that how they share food with their friends. I was on a trip, I brought 2 sandwiches with me, and one girl never used to bring food or fruit to school, and I would share my fruit at break time several times. On the trip, I gave her a sandwich because she didn't have any food with her, not even a water bottle. To lack food is a situation that in poverty research is labeled absolute deprivation. Such absolute deprivation is, however, not necessarily what children associate with the term poverty in our countries. For most children in Nordic countries, poverty is probably rarely defined by hunger. It is more often understood in relative terms. Wearing older clothes, having the cheaper phone, not having what others have. Across studies and reports, children constantly frame poverty as a matter of relative position. This is a non-poor 15-year-old Finnish boy who says this about poverty. When poverty is experienced as falling behind others, social interaction may involve exposure. Differences become visible in everyday situations, in homes, on school trips, in conversations about hobbies or holidays. Some children limit participation in order to avoid such exposure. I would never bring home friends because it's so embarrassing that we have so few things compared to others. This kind of withdrawal may protect dignity, but it also restricts access to peer networks and shared arenas. And in this way, economic differences can have social consequences for the children. But children may also step back from social arenas because they are aware that participation has a price. Across Nordic studies and reports, children repeatedly describe cost as a barrier to participation. Data from Ungdata in Norway shows a clear social gradient. Among lower secondary students, participation in organizations, clubs, or associations varies from 37% among those with the lowest socioeconomic status to 74% among those with the highest. And children themselves says it very clearly. If leisure activities were free, many children would go there. When activities require fees, equipment, or transport, participation becomes conditional. And for some children, the solution is to opt out. Another dimension children speak about is tension at home. Research often refers to this as a family stress pathway. Financial strain can increase stress within the household. Children notice this. They describe a more tense atmosphere when money is tight, more irritability, more worry, and sometimes more conflicts. Even when parents try to shield them, children are aware. In a Finnish study, 42% of children in low-income family reported worrying about their parents' finances. Children are not outside the strain, they sense it. And sensing the strain is only part of the story. Many children start to respond to that strain. They know that activities, clothes, and school trips cost money. Some express guilt, and some begin to see themselves as financial burdens. Across studies, a consistent pattern appears. Children develop strategies to parents' worries. They may avoid asking for things, they may turn down activities, and they plan when to raise a question. So children exercise agency to protect their parents. This agency reflects responsibility taken on early, not parental failure. Financial strain does not imply poor parenting. On the contrary, research showed that warmth and commitment across socioeconomic groups. What children describe is pressure, not a lack of care. But these strategies also have an emotional dimension. Several children describe a strong sense of embarrassment. Everything is so embarrassing. It's embarrassing to have no money. It's embarrassing to lie to friends. It's embarrassing to talk about how I feel. And it's embarrassing when people are sympathetic. It's embarrassing no matter what I do, and I feel like I'm worth less than everyone else. But shame is not only a private feeling, it affects participation, help-seeking, and children's sense of worth. It shapes how children position themselves in social settings, and it reinforces withdrawal. In other words, shame influences how children engage with the very institutions meant to support them. It affects how they participate in school, services, and social arenas. And when participation is shaped by shame, this becomes a matter not only of individual well-being, but of institutional design. That is why children's experiences have implications for research and policy. If shame shapes children's everyday participation, it may also shape how they engage within the institutions and decision-making arenas. Participation in institutions cannot be taken for granted, but participation of young children and young people matters for several reasons. Participation can in itself transform children's lives. It can strengthen their self-esteem, their sense of control, and sense of belonging. Participation can also improve policies and services because children and young people bring in knowledge that adults do not possess. And it can contribute to democratic competence and social cohesion, and thereby to more inclusive societies. If participation has these effects, the next question is how to make it meaningful in practice. Because participation does not happen automatically. It requires deliberate design. If participation cannot be taken for granted, it must be built into the institutions. This involves a systematic approach. One needs to seek children's voices across services, not only in isolated projects. It requires methodological diversity, recognizing that conversation alone is not always sufficient. Other methods may be necessary to include all children. It depends on professional competence and organizational space. Professionals must be given both the expertise and the space to work in ways that allows children to participate. And it requires a lowering thresholds for children facing multiple barriers so that all children have a chance to participate, also children from low-income families. And it requires continuity, participation over time, not one-off statements. And finally, we still need more knowledge about how participation works in practice for children in general and for children in low-income families in particular. Children's voices do not provide simple solutions to complex problems as child poverty, but they deepen our understanding of how poverty shapes everyday lives. And children offer knowledge that would otherwise remain invisible. Children's accounts do not replace structural indicators, they complement them. Together, structural indicators and children voices provide a fuller understanding of poverty in the Nordic welfare states. Thank you.
Thank you, Tone. Very interesting. And chapter 4 in the report. And you also mentioned that there's not a lot of research available on children's own experiences and voices on growing up in low-income families. Why is that? Aren't we interested?
Well, I think it's several reasons. I think one reason is that we have very good quantitative data in the Nordic countries, and they are so good that maybe we have outcrowded the need for qualitative data. I think another reason is that for politicians, it's more difficult to transform individual accounts to policy. It's easier with quantitative data. So I think it's not, it's also a kind of financial situation. It's not that often in demand, these qualitative surveys. And there are, of course, some ethical and methodological barriers also in these studies, how to select the kids to recruit, and the question of stigmatizations when you recruit them. And maybe also there is an assumption that we have such good welfare system and so equal services that there are no big differences in how children from different economic backgrounds experience their worlds. I think that is some of the reasons why this is not so much in demand.
Okay. Thank you for that. Anyone in the room who has a question for Tone? Okay. I don't have one here either. I have a question if the report is available, and it is. It's published now, and I also had, is it in English? And it is. But there's, as we are a Nordic institution, there's a summary in Norwegian as well. So thank you very much, Tone. Yes, and next we have finished all the chapters in the report, but we have yet one presentation to go before we have a short technical break before we have the panel discussion. So everyone who is in line who have a question for the panelists, the presenters of today, can put their questions in the Q&A function. So we have something to ask the panel about. But first, Vitor Miranda on the Nordic Statistics Database and availability. That has been a hot topic here today. You're welcome.
Thank you. So as said, my name is Vitor Miranda. I'm head of statistics here at Norregio, and I'm going to present today on the Nordic Statistics Database. Like my colleague Maria and Deborah, who presented before me, I work also here at Norregio in this house where we are today. And we are about 60 colleagues doing research, applied research on the different broad of topics under the Nordic Council of Ministers, helping to bridge the scientific knowledge and policy making. Among all these different initiatives that we have, we work specifically with two databases, the Nordic Statistics Database, which I'll talk about today, but we also have another database called the Nordic Health and Welfare Statistics Database. For those of you who are not familiar with the Nordic Statistics Database, it's found online at this address, nordicstatistics.org. It's fully free and open to the public, no login or payment required. It's fully open data. And we cover 17 different topic areas, all the way from environment to economics and health. We have more than 200 indicators, about 250 indicators. And on the Nordic countries, comparable statistics that we collect from trusted sources, such as the national statistical offices, but also international institutes like Eurostat, OECD, UN, and among others. And our target groups are the Nordic Council of Ministers, of course, but also policymakers around the Nordic countries and abroad, researchers, the media, and the general public. Besides the 17 areas that we have, on the special area called indicators, we try to make a cross-sectorial selection of data. So instead of talking just about one topic like health or economics or environment, we take the topics, all topics around a specific group. And one of those is children and young people, which I'll present on today. So this is going to be just a quick overview, like a taste for you to see what kind of data we have there. And I invite you to, after this meeting, go in on the website and look for more. I divided the statistics among this list of topics, starting with demography, with population. And this is one concrete example of data you'll find in our statistics. We've been talking a lot about children and young people today, but how many children and young people exist in the Nordic countries? If you're interested in this question, you would have to go to every single of the statistical offices and try to gather this data yourself and navigate their statistical databases. Or you could go to our website where you easily find this information compiled for you. Just to give you an idea of how important that is, look at the light blue line there representing Iceland. In the 70s in Iceland, almost half, about 45% of the population of Iceland were children or young people, 0 to 19 years old. Today has been declined to about a quarter, 25%. And we combine that with information for the official forecasts for the countries. And if you forward to 2070, will be less than 20% of the population of Iceland will be children. And similar trend for all the Nordic countries. So children as a percentage of the population, a share of the population has been historically declining and is forecasted to continue declining. And behind this is both explaining this is falling birth rates. People used to have many more children in the 70s than they have now, but also people are living longer. So older people are living longer. So as a share of the whole population, children are becoming a smaller share. We also have statistics that are specifically custom-made by the National Statistical Office for this database. You only find it there about the population by, we could call it immigrant background, so to say. And here are statistics of the population of children 5 to 9 year old in the different Nordic countries. By those, you can see those who are foreign born or those who are native born with foreign born parents, which are the gray bars, or the native population, which is the yellow bars. So you can see, for instance, that this called second generation or children born in the country with foreign born parents varies from 10% in Denmark to 19% in Sweden, almost as double. For the 5 to 9 year olds. Here's just total. You can go and look even more specific. How many of them comes from Ukraine or from Brazil or other countries? More zoom in, more specific detail. And I invite you to do that after this presentation. The income statistics that Deborah presented, we have that, some of that there as well. Here's I'm not going to cover this because Deborah already talked about it, but children living at the risk of poverty. But we also have a bit of labor market statistics. And here I'm presenting for what's called young adults, so to say, 15 to 29 year olds. It's a classic indicator that are those that are not in education or employment. And you see the gray line is the average for the EU. So all Nordic countries are below the EU average for young people, meaning that young people are either studying or working. But there's still some variation among the Nordic countries. For example, the lowest level we find in Iceland. Iceland, the more young people are much more likely to be working or in education. Whereas, if I'm not mistaken, there the blue is Finland, is the Nordic country where the situation, if you consider it as a social issue, the situation would be worse. Education, it's perhaps in this room, most people here probably are aware of this historical trend of test scores going down in the Nordic countries among young people. And here's for 15-year-olds in the Nordic countries. The PISA is the standardized test results. In this case, is for reading, but we also have for mathematics and I think science as well, if I'm not mistaken. And the results have been going down. The Faroe Islands for a while was going against that trend as going up, but from 2015 to 2018 has slightly gone down as well, and we are in 2022 now, but looking to add new data, more recent data as well, as soon as it becomes available to us. We can look at either more specific aspects of children's health. And here we compiled information about 13-year-olds who have drunk alcohol in their lifetime. Before looking at this, I would imagine to be close to 0 in Nordic countries. But when you look at boys in Denmark, 40% of 13-year-olds have drunk alcohol at some point in their lives, compared to about 10% in Greenland. Mental health of 11-year-olds who have been reported to have been bullied at school in the previous couple of months, highest level in Greenland. And girls seem to be bullied more than boys. We can discuss why that is. Those of you who are expert on this topic may have an explanation. And I saved the last concrete example related to leisure and culture aspects of life. 13-year-olds who have intense online contact with friends and others. And you see that girls are more likely to have contact with friends via online means than boys. And Sweden stands out, higher levels than, for example, Iceland. So different aspects we can go up and discuss about the quality of life of children. Here, just to sum up what I just presented, the function of this database is to be a resource for you, easy to use with a clear interface. Either you're a researcher, you can dig in and get all the specifics for your research, but also if you're just someone curious about the life of children, can go in and look at the graphs. Different sources combined, flexible to use. And also, I know the flexibility to add additional tables. That's one aspect of being in this Nordic cooperation. We can always contact us. And then we have great contact with NVC, for example. We're always exploring possibilities of adding new interesting tables to the database. Some challenges, just to quickly mention, as some of you already perhaps know, this database was placed somewhere else, and then this was transferred to Norregio this year. We started with onboarding the new team, recruiting new people to help us maintain this database. So this first year is a challenge for us, but we are already in the second month of that and full work, 100% or more. Yeah, and we combine survey-based statistics, which are great. They're freely available in other sources like the Eurostat, but this are much more, has some limitations regarding how much we can break down the data. If it's a survey with fewer than 1,000 respondents, maybe you cannot go in at the municipal level or break down by all the social groups you would like to. And then we sometimes turn to register-based data, as Deborah mentioned before, which is everyone in the country you're looking at administrative records. And then you can zoom in specific social groups. But one issue with that is that different countries, Nordic countries, may define things differently. So what is poverty in one country may not be in another country. And we have to try to harmonize that information. So that was all I had to show you today. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Vitor. A lot of statistics available right at your fingertips there. Very good. And you also mentioned some challenges here and some indicators you're working on. But do you have any new indicators in plan? What's in the pipeline? What can we see?
Yeah. One project that we've been working intensively this year is regarding statistics on people with disability in collaboration with NVC as well. That's one aspect that we don't have at the moment in the database. No statistics on persons with disability. We want to include that. And within that broad range, we also want to take into consideration the children's perspective. So include also the statistics broken down by age groups. We could look at the situation of children in particular as well.
Great. Anyone who has a question for Vitor? Then we will take that questions that might rise during the panel discussion. So we will now have a short technical break, 5 minutes, and see you soon. Right, welcome back from that quick break. And now we're back with the panel, and we're going to have a nice discussion, and I feel free to join, to add to the discussion and get answers on your questions. And it's a lot of knowledge in this room, and it's a lot of knowledge by among the ones who are participating online as well. So this could be fun. Just a repetition, we have Deborah Birger, Tone Fletten, Vitor Miranda, og Geir Møller. Geir Holtan Møller, right. So, yeah. So that's us, and I'm Anna Ranninen from Nordic Welfare Center. And we've heard a lot of things here today about children living in low-income families, children living in families with persistently low income, and child poverty, and everything in between. And that's quite a discussion. And one thing that I would want to ask you, which might sound a bit crazy at this hour, but is it really relevant to talk about child poverty in the Nordic countries? And I give the word first to you, Tone, and the rest of you can follow.
Do I need to turn it on? No, it's
Yeah.
on? Yeah. For me, it's relevant, of course. That should be obvious after the presentations I gave. I think it's important to keep in mind that poverty, the reason why some are reluctant to use the term poverty is because they don't feel familiar with the relative poverty concept. And many people have visions of, you know, poor kids in Africa, or what's happened in the Nordics in the just after the Second World War, with or before the Second World War, with a lot of economic problems, and they don't think of lack of participation as a poverty problem. And there's also an sort of belief that there is something that is real poverty, and what we talk about today is not real poverty. And in my opinion, that is just confusion, because poverty is nothing objective. Poverty is a normative concept. No matter what country you are in or what situation you are in, poverty is nothing that you can say that this is poverty and this is not. It's always a political discussion, political decision. And we as researchers, we can't define that the line is exactly here. If you are below that line, you're poor. If you're above that line, you're not poor. That's why the risk of poverty concept has been more prevalent in the recent year. But this is a normative concept, and I think that Molly Olshansky, who is the American economist, who was the first one to define poverty in the US, she said that poverty is like beauty; it lies in the eyes of the beholder. So what you see as poverty is subjective. I guess that all people in this room would see poverty in a bit different way. So what we do, we have to have some way to measure it, and we have to set a line, and we can adjust it, and we can discuss the line. But I think that the term, the moment you accept that the term is normative, it's okay to use the term.
You were nodding heavily, Deborah. Do you have some reflections?
I think what we are also kind of like using many times is this World Bank definition of poverty, which is giving a line that is so under what we are having here in the Nordics. But it doesn't mean that when we are comparing children within the same society, there is relative poverty, and there are kids that having more and kids that having less. And this comparison, living every day with this comparison that just Tone mentioned, these two fonts are part of the way children are growing up and living. And nowadays that we also see that with the increase in the prices, also other aspect of real aspect of feeling that you don't have the same extent of clothing, not being able to participate, and to the extreme extent of saying, I go to school without having breakfast. But maybe it's that's the exception. but there is something that we should refer to it exactly as Tone said, as a normative, as a part of the society, which we base it on a relative term within the same society that we are living in.
Geir, you have something to add?
Yes, of course, it's relevant to talk about poverty, but in my opinion, it's also at least very relevant to talk about social mobility. If we lack social mobility, then we also have a problem in the society. And there's, in my opinion, you can see some tendency to that it's more difficult to take higher education, for instance. My own example is no problem. I got money from the Lånekassen in Norway to take education. It's more difficult today. So social mobility is an issue, I think.
Victor?
No, I think they said everything about
They've
this question.
covered it. Anyone in the room who has something to add to this question? Victor, can you? Yes, great.
Maybe not a question, but more like a call to action for this group here. And I've been struggling with this in Iceland, and that is defining child poverty. We must be able to, as the Nordics at least, to have some kind of definition, whether it is a rope or something else that we think fits well into the Nordic context. I think we could really do that. And I think something that's been missing today is talking about material deprivation. Why are we not using that as an indicator? Maybe because the Eurostat one is not that great for Nordic countries. Maybe it's missing the thing that was in your slide, Tone, the mobile phone, for example. These things that really matter in the Nordic countries. I'm just wondering, is that something we can come around together here as a group, have an official definition, Nordic one, what is child poverty in the Nordics?
Just a comment to that. I agree that we should try to find a Nordic definition. The problem is that we need a definition that is also measurable without having to collect new data every year. And that's why we used the EU Silk or other surveys, because we can't have large consumption surveys, for instance, regularly to find out how many are they. And that's why the income poverty line is so efficient, because we have the data is reliable, we can compare over time across nations and within nations. So it's an easy way to measure the development in a society. And it's not a perfect indicator, there's many problems with it, but it's a measure and indicator that is really easy for us to use. So that also you have to balance to have an indicator that is good enough to cover everything, and one that is actually feasible to use for researchers across the countries.
Victor, do you have anything to comment on that?
I'm not an expert in child poverty, but I'm an expert in statistics. And I can say that the problem that we see with all surveys is that they're very expensive. They become very expensive each year. Back in the 80s, you would call someone on the phone and would interview them, and we get 90% of the population to answer that survey. There would be mothers working home to answer that call. These days, everyone's working all the time. People have cell phones. They don't answer the survey calls anymore. So we have response rates of 10%, 15% if you're lucky. So that's why governments have been turning away a little bit from surveys and using more this register data and administrative data. So I don't know what the new indicator would be, but it would probably fall within this category of a register-based, administrative-based measure of poverty from the statistical point of view, I think.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add?
Related to that, also that we need to remember that also the definition of material deprivation, which aspects are needed to be in this basket of needs that individuals change over time. And if we want to be able to compare, that's bring another issues of complexity. Even within the Eurostat, they update what is this question and what they are based, because we want to be able to compare, and it kind of like brings another complexity. I'm not saying that Europe is perfect, but that's what we have at the moment, and that's what they mainly use to compare.
Maybe everyone isn't familiar with the basket and thing. Could you explain a bit?
Okay, that material deprivation is based on a list of questions or a questionnaire in which individual ask, do you have the access to a mobile phone or to a car and so forth? Can you eat meat once every few days? So then this list of indicators that or questions that we define that are the basic needs also change over time. What we as a society defined as a basic need change. Of course, many years ago, phone was not part of it, or having your own room also changed over time within the household. So we need to consider that we need to have an indicator that can be also comparable over years, and not just the aspect of the cost of having these surveys that are so expensive. So that's why we are using the EU Silk.
Thank you very much for that clarification, Deborah. Well, we're going to move on to the next question, and that is, we're going to play here. So you're going to use thumbs up, thumbs down, or a flat hand. So given the development in the last few years when it comes to child poverty in the Nordic countries, in what direction you think we're heading? With the same measures that we have in place today, nothing new, what will at risk of poverty look like, let's say 10 years from now? If you think it's going to be a positive development, thumbs up, negative development, thumbs down, no big changes, flat hand, please. And you think you are being let off the hook. You're not. You do the same. Positive, up, negative, down, flat line. Yeah, very different expectations. Don't let go. Up again. Yeah, you think it's going to be better, Tone. Why?
Because I have to be optimistic. So I've been working with this for 20 years. No, I have seen poverty rates rise.
Yeah.
And I've seen them leveled out. And I've seen how the attention towards child poverty has increased. And there are action plans, there are attention, there are systems in place that can improve the situation. And I think that the governments in our countries are aware of the problem and that they're really trying to do something about it. And I'm also hopeful because there has, as we have said several times here, the immigrants are a special risk. But what we see, at least in Norway, is the second generation of immigrants. They're doing very well in school, for instance. So I think there is the social mobility will help us. So I think indexation of transfers, good education, also second generation immigrants. I hope it'll be better.
And you thought the opposite. Why?
Of course, I'm being put on the spot. First, because I'm a much more pessimistic person than Tone. That's how it is. It's a default. And second, because I have a feeling that unfortunately we are going into increased inequality, and hope is a measurement of inequality in the lower part of the distribution. So that's my feeling, and I hope I'm mistaken, and I hope integration will go to the right direction. But if we don't put a lot of emphasis, I have a feeling that we are going to the other direction. But I really want to get some of Tone's perspective.
Any other optimists or pessimists who want to share their opinion in the room? No? We'll move on then. And the next question is strongly related to this one, of course, because now it was business as usual, or a treatment as usual that we were discussing. So what do you think is the most important knowledge gap? And if you could choose one single measure that would be crucial for the development, what would that be? And we will begin with Geir.
Well, if we take those measures we have been writing about, I think what is crucial is early intervention, and therefore early childhood and kindergarten and universal measures in kindergarten and combined with family programs. I think I would, the area where we need more knowledge is maybe in the school, how we can make school an arena where who can make equalization or because this is so important, and today we know it is maybe also having the opposite effect.
The compensatory effect that
More
schools can
compensatory
have, and also I forgot to say that we have a lot of people working in the municipalities and also in the educational systems I've seen on the list, and also a lot of NGO. And if you have knowledge gaps and measures that you want to lift, use the chat and put them in there so we can have a look at your point of view as well, beside from the researchers here on stage and in the room. Next, just anyone who wants it takes it.
I think from the policy perspective, we need more knowledge on the causal pathways between low income and the outcomes. And we need that information for different groups. And that would enable us to introduce measures and policies that we know are effective to prevent this that poverty is inherited and that poverty leads to bad outcomes. So I think that is an important area for study in the coming years.
Yeah. Deborah, you have anything to add? No?
There is also a specific group of young people who is not entering into the labor market right now. I think this is also an important group. We have autism, it is other kinds of diagnosis, but there is a small group who is not entering into the labor market, and it seems to be increasing a bit. And why is a question. I have a daughter working in the labor administration in Norway, and she's working with this group, and they are increasing, and they don't know why they are. So this is also an important group, I think.
I would just like to comment, to add to what you said before about the audience that is watching us. I think also, from my perspective, a knowledge gap is on the spatial distribution of poverty. A lot of the statistics that are presented here today is at national level. We have very little at the regional level. That's generally where the interventions happen. It could happen at the municipality level, could happen at the school level. If you don't have the measures to follow up on that, you don't know how that is affecting. We could remain at the same level of poverty in the countries, whereas the poverty is concentrated in specific areas. You're creating pockets of highly concentrated poverty in the country, which it disappears when you take it at the national level.
I agree with that, but also since we are here in a Nordic audience, there is very little comparative Nordic research on child poverty or poverty in general. And there have been several discussions here today about why is this so, and why is the numbers you present different, and what could be the reason behind the different numbers. So I think that this report may be a start on a more Nordic comparative research on poverty, and I think that would be really interesting for us, both because we share many of the same foundations and many of the same policy institutions, and we have the same challenges. So I think to compare across nations would be really helpful for all of us.
Okay, and related to that, we can kind of this is part of what we also kind of call into action, is that we can use what we have is the registers, but it does require a lot of work in terms of having a definition that is comparable when using the register. And then we can also go and zoom down, not only at a national or going to the municipal level, trying to look at different groups of migrants, how they are doing in different aspects. But that's, again, require a focus, a measurement, and trying to focus our research on that. And that's cost also.
Great. Anyone in the room who wants to share anything?
Thank you. And thank you for your discussion. It's very interesting. I think what I sometimes feel is missing in the debate as a researcher is the structural element. When we talk child poverty, children, if you look only at the income part, they are poor because their parents are poor. And in Denmark, at least speaking from my perspective, we can see quite dramatic changes when parents become poorer, especially those on social benefits. We can also see the opposite when aids for that is being implemented. So I think in the Nordic countries, we need to talk about welfare systems when we talk about child poverty and also welfare state retrenchment. Because as Gaia and Karin were saying in the end of the presentation, we cannot talk about only relational efforts. We need also to talk about the structural foundation of that. And I think that would be wonderful if that became a topic also.
Yes, I'm trying to read the chat as well. I haven't forgotten about you. But we also got a comment here about that it's not really normalized to talk about class differences. And there's no understanding of low income families or individuals and so forth. More a comment than anything else. And we also did have a question that is because we have talked about some of the effects that child poverty can have, but what do we know about specific effects? For example, violence. How is the connection between experiencing poverty or growing up in these families and be abused or sort of that? That was one question. Anyone has anything on that?
It's difficult to study that because we don't have any registered data on violence. And there could be accounts of that poor kids experience more violence, but there is a Norwegian study published last year showing that parents in low-income families had just as caring and warm operating strategies as other parents. So there was no sign there that parents from poor families were more violent or more harsh towards their children. This is known from other countries, but at least that Norwegian study did not show that. So, and I don't know of any other studies in our countries looking specifically at this in a way that is generalizable, that we could say that there's, of course, I'm sure that there are accounts of such incidences, but I don't think that is statistically significant or that we can say that, well, poor families or so. But this Norwegian study is actually working on the large databases, large data sets.
Anyone else who has something to yes, please.
I'm Ingar Brattbakk from Oslo Metropolitan University. Thank you first for very good presentations and interesting discussion. I want to follow up a bit on the regional aspect. The report says something about rural areas. And I think that also a knowledge gap because traditionally child poverty has kind of been an urban challenge mostly. And is it so really that it's now a more rural problem? You don't say that, but you just say that the income, based on the income level. But when you take into account the cost of living and housing costs, I think the picture may be different. So it's just a question of how we, the image we put of kind of the poverty and where it's strongest. We did something about that in Norway, and we saw that inside municipalities there was a strong concentration, especially in urban areas. And we also see some tendencies of suburban poverty, that the low-income families are kind of pressured out of the areas with high housing prices. So I think that's also a field that it's important to know more about.
I think it's a very important topic, question that you bring up, because within the report, what we've done is that we just use the IROP that is available at the National Statistical Offices. And considering that this is the only indicator that we could find, then it is at municipal level, which means that we don't look at specific neighborhoods. And if you look at the case of Gothenburg, for example, there are neighborhoods that are having higher rate. And when you average across the municipality, of course, the poverty rate is relatively low. And again, considering that we use the AROP, exactly as you say, then we are comparing the income at the national level, and then we have this concentration at municipalities because the income level there is lower, but of course also that the cost of living might be lower. So we can't have it when we use it, this indicator. And again, then we should use something that is register based or something else that can be comparable across the countries, but that's what we had for this report and for kind of like this outcome. And it's very important because it is not giving the full picture. And when we say there is higher AROP, it doesn't mean that really children, they are feeling more poor because probably they are also comparing themselves to the children around them. So even if it's 25% of them that in Sweden, in some municipalities that they define themselves, that are defined as AROP, they are comparing them to the children in their municipality. And if there is no high inequality within the municipality, maybe the deprivation of the feeling, exactly as Tony was bringing up, it's not that high.
Keep it in the panel. Did you want to? Yes, please.
Yeah, this is a kind of nerdy technical comment, but there's also a problem or a challenge with the income measurement, because when we measure income from like our jobs, it's no problem. We know what we earn. But if you are a fisherman or a farmer or you work in primary sector, it's not always clear how to define the income. And that is a challenge because you have specific ways to deduct expenses, for instance, in these kind of professions. And that makes the income measurement a bit less valid than it does when you have, you have income, you have a tax, and that's it.
Yeah.
So this has been this. I know that statistics central bureaus have been struggling with this, how to measure incomes for some of the professions in the society.
Victor is nodding. Yeah. Yeah. We have a question here up front.
Thank you. It's actually not a question. It's a comment on the remarks from you, Deborah, that it's true. I think it's an interesting point that you say that, children compare themselves with probably other children in the same municipality, right? Which I think is probably true. I just want to add an aspect now that we have digital media right now. And we know that a lot of the children and young people, they're in the Nordic countries, they're almost 100%, they're online. So I think there's an added aspect there that they're actually also now comparing themselves with other children online. So it might add an interesting aspect.
Thank you. Anything else? Any more who want to contribute to the discussion or grill the panel? If not, let's give them a warm applause. And thank you for doing this. I know you love it. And I'm going also to give you presents because I've forgotten all day. So here. Thank you. You got one of those probably. Thank you. And thank you. And again. Please get off the stage. Yes, and now I would just like to call up, just leave it. Merete, my colleague, we will finish as we started, so to speak, me and Merete. Maybe we should stand here. Would that be the best? Perhaps. And I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did.
Oh, yes, I did.
Yes.
Very much.
Yes.
So thankful for all the great contributions from the outstanding researchers we have with us today that has contributed. It has been a real pleasure cooperating with you. And I hope we can continue a bit.
Yeah. And there has been some, especially in the panel, there was some, could be a Nordic initiative, and this is something you could work on further on. And that leads me to ask you to reflect on what do you think is the Nordic added value of this project? Why a Nordic report? Why not national reports, sort of?
Oh, that's a huge question, Anna. And I could probably keep going for an hour then.
Keep it short.
I think the most important thing we do when we cooperate at the Nordic level is to gather knowledge and research and how to find point of departure for where we would like to develop measures and policy to make the well-being of our kids better in the Nordic region. And I think when it comes to measuring child poverty, we have a unique position to say something about the development of the welfare and the well-being of children and youth in our region. And I think I agree with the panel. We need to look into how we can measure this over time, also to follow the development. We can sort of engage in outlining better measures, but also cooperate on better measures. So we need perhaps to look into how we measure it, but I think we also need to, at some point, stand down from the discussion on how we interpret poverty and perhaps move forward to the measures. And I think with this report, we have tried to highlight what we know and that we can sort of also point to some measures that is important to use and in use today.
Promising.
Yeah,
practices.
we used to call it promising practice, and that's really the Nordic gold, I think, the promising practice, and move forward on that part.
So what initiatives would you like to follow from this project as a result? What would be the next step?
If I could choose, I would go into more promising practices, to finding the pathways that Tone asked about. How can we aid those who fall behind? And how can we reach the goal of the Nordic cooperation, the best place for a child to grow up, I think. So that's, yeah. And also, I would think we should, something that I don't think Karin and Geit said that today, but I think we do a lot of pilot studies and we implement a lot of measures that we test, but we don't continue with them. So I think in the Nordic region, we have a lot of knowledge. So if we can move forward and cooperate on those measures that actually are so promising that we can say this is something we recommend that everyone does. I think that's...
Is it about financing, or why doesn't you go further with the pilot study?
At the municipal level, I think it's often about financing and also about turnover. The people that knows how to work with ECEC, for instance, on the long run are not perhaps the ones who are implementing it. So, and the funding is not there, I think, to keep it going. And, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good request. And tomorrow, in this very room, we are meeting a lot of researchers, many already here in the room, some arriving this evening, to discuss a Nordic research network on children and poverty and social exclusion. Could you say a few words about that?
Yeah, we have, in the outlining of this report, we have had a lot of support from a lot of experts. And some of the research experts that have been a reference group, we have invited them to come here because they are interested in looking on how we can continue to cooperate on this issue going forward. So what we're really hoping to is to start up and also show the Nordic Council of Ministers and the Nordic Council that it's a huge interest in this field, and we're eager to see how they will continue this work.
So exciting. Thank you very much, Merete. You can switch slides for me. Just use the arrow. Yeah. Right. Thank you. And by that, I want to thank all of you here today, all of you watching online, all of you here in the room, and all that have been presenting today. Thank you.